Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in direction of the northern front by Kharkiv, where there are reported to be fighting by the Russians storming the village of Lipsy here in the northern front. However, there are no reports of advances here in the past 12 hours. With this, we see that positional fighting continues at the outskirts by the Ukrainian fortifications that were prepared in the areas, unlike the ones before, which allowed the Russians to simply walk through. We see here in the eastern parts of it, the Russians captured the remaining parts of Staritsia, gaining full control of the village, expanding their control over the section here by the Sverdlovsk river line, and widening the front in the area. To the east, we see fighting continues in Vovchansk, where the Russians are attempting to gain full control over the northern parts, where positional fighting continues over the last section of it, with heavy bombardment of the town continuing day in and day out. To the east, the Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of Tychy, as well as push onwards towards Sumy, where they are fighting along the river line here to the north, and are now moving down southwards along of it. We see that the Russians are here attempting to push down to gain control over Sumy, which will expand the angle at which the Russians have the front line along the river line and towards Pokuliane and other villages in the area ahead of a Russian push through the river line. The Russians may continue to push in an eastern direction to gain full control over the northern parts of the river line, or possibly enter from multiple directions through the Russian border with Ukraine. This will allow the Russians to have full control over the northern parts of the river line before moving on to the southern parts. However, it is unclear exactly how far east they are willing to go before crossing the river. They currently have a very wide front that spans approximately 30 kilometers with this range of 27 kilometers from one end to another. I'll return to this northern front following the rest of the frontline update, where we see here in the direction of Berestove, the Russians stormed the village following this assault that allowed them to gain to the outskirts to it. Now with the storming of it, they managed to gain a foothold in the northern parts, capturing that part and moving on the fighting to the central parts of the village, where heavy fighting is taking place for the Russians to take control of it. If the Russians gain control over Berestove, the Battle of Pishany can begin, and this will enter the battle here in the eastern Kharkiv region into a new stage, as it will allow the Russians to push towards Pishany. Capturing that would allow the Russians to start an operation towards Kupiansk from the east. Moving further south, we see here in the direction of Bilorivka, the Russians attack the village itself, moving to the eastern outskirts of the first buildings of the village. This means that the Russians are attacking the village proper for the first time in over a year. The Ukrainian main positions are not in the village, but on the heights to the northwest of the village and the chalk quarry to the south of it. Both of these positions the Russians need to gain control of if they wish to gain control over Bilorivka. This means that the attack from the north is likely directed towards the hills here to the west rather than the village itself in the center. Further south, we see here in the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have started an offensive operation across this section of the front line from the north by Bohdanivka and Kalininia, and down south towards Ivanivsky by the canal area. In this section, the Russians are now attacking pretty much everywhere towards the fortifications to the north, towards Kalininia by the crossing, towards the micros district of Chasiv Yar, and through the canal line here, where the Russians are gaining control over the crossing between the eastern and western parts of it. The Russians are here attempting to gain an advantage from the redirection of Ukrainian troops from this section of the front line to the northern front by Kharkiv. And this is what brings me to the analysis that I skipped over, and that is the current estimate is that the Ukrainians have about 15,000 soldiers simply in the Chasiv Yar area here west of Bakhmut, and about 30,000 troops in the north to defend against the Russian offensive. This 30,000 troops in the north is a ragtag group of different units. It includes the GRU of the Ukrainian Special Forces, it includes territorial defense, and it includes regular units. So we have anything from the pretty much no training, poorly equipped soldiers to special forces, and anything in between is grouped up to this 30,000 troops. According to my sources, I have talked with and discussed both my Ukrainian and Russian sources, combining both of their reports into one. There is an estimate of somewhere around 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers at the front, and there is hardly any reserves, if any. The Ukrainians have committed all of their brigades to the front. And the way the Ukrainian frontline works is, in simple terms, previously the Ukrainians had reserves somewhere around, scattered around the country. This would number over 100,000 troops. While at the front line, they would have several hundred thousands of troops all across the front. At the start, the Ukrainians would use brigade-sized units, which are about 4,000 soldiers, 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers. Now they are using battalion-sized units, which are about 1,000 soldiers. This is to have a wider range of how many units they have available and being able to disperse them across the front. The Ukrainians have 15,000 battalions in the Chasiv Yar direction and 30 battalions in the Kharkiv direction. This is where the 30,000 number and the 15,000 number comes from. Now the situation has significantly changed in the sense that Ukrainian reserves that were previously pretty much guaranteed to never fight, ones who are more in a elite class or simply from Western Ukraine, who were promised they would just build some fortifications in the rear, look out in the border by Belarus, or simply just sit around and relaxing in the west. They are now being sent to the front to plug the gaps. This is something that is very significant because, number one, ones who are not fighting from the start of the war until now and have simply been sitting around, going to the front suddenly while being promised that they shouldn't, would have significantly lower morale than the ones who have been fighting endlessly. Now, the second part is that, as I mentioned, the Ukrainians hardly have any reserves yet. This is because the vast majority, if not every single battalion, is sent to the front to plug the gaps. The Ukrainians do not hold anything in reserve because the Russian pressure is simply too intense. This is why they are rapidly mobilizing as many as they can, because they need to build up a reserve in case the Russians expand the front line, and this is expected in the direction of Sumy. It is reported that if the Ukrainians are to face off against a Russian offensive here in the Sumy direction, if it is a massive offensive unlike the current incursion into Kharkiv direction, if it is a massive offensive with 50 to 100,000 Russian troops, the Ukrainians would be hard-pressed to even gather 50,000, much less 100,000 to hold the lines. This means that the Ukrainians would have to redirect forces from other sections of the front line to the point at which points at the front line may be left completely unmanned, with not a single soldier holding the front. That is how critical the situation is for the Ukrainians when it comes to manpower. Ukrainian soldiers fighting in the Zaporizhzhia direction report that it is largely silent. There's not too much action. We have mostly just seen some positional fighting by the Vermevsky Ledge, where the Russians started storming Staromayorsk and Urashane. We've seen some recent advances in Mervopil, and the Russians captured most of Robotyne. Well, that's about it. Compared to the Donetsk, Kharkiv, and Luhansk regions, this is completely insignificant. Meanwhile, Ukrainian soldiers in the Donetsk region were reporting 2 months ago that the situation was difficult. A month ago, they were saying that the situation was pretty much very bad. And now they're reporting that the situation is critical and near a breaking point. If even just a single battalion is moved from the east to the north, that would significantly impact the frontline positions of the Ukrainians in the section of the front line. In the north, the Russians have a large concentration of troops. That means that if the Ukrainian soldiers remove any of their soldiers, the Russians can launch an offensive there. So we're seeing that the Russians are pretty much overmanned on the whole front line. The estimate of Ukrainian soldiers along the entirety of the front line is somewhere around 400,000 soldiers, from Kherson to Kharkiv. The Russians, on the other hand, have upwards of 600,000 to 700,000 soldiers. This gives a 1.5 advantage to the Russians across the whole front. and this will allow the Russians to gain a 3-1 or 5-1 advantage localized across the front. Currently, it is reported that somewhere between 4 and 10,000 Russian soldiers are fighting in the north. They are facing off against 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers. This means at other sections of the front, the Russians have a significant manpower advantage, like the Luhansk region, like the Donetsk region by Ocheretine, where the Russians are regularly advancing. However, in the direction of Chasiv Yar, there is a 1-to-1 power arrangement, as the Ukrainians have 15 battalions, that's approximately 15,000 soldiers. The Russians have 1 division, which is approximately 15,000 soldiers. So this is an even matching. So with this, we see that across the front, there are parts where there is an even manpower concentration. There are parts where the Ukrainians have an advantage, and there are parts where the Russians have an advantage. But overall, the Russians have a 1.5 advantage. This means that the Russians have the advantage across the front. Yet they have still allowed the Ukrainians to have localized advantages. This means that the Russians have a lot of soldiers in reserve. And having a lot of soldiers in reserve when the other side, the Ukrainians in this case, do not. That means that if the Russians launch an offensive elsewhere, the Sumy region, the Chernihiv region, or even Zaporizhia or Kherson, the Russians would have a significant manpower advantage. And this brings us back to the Kharkiv region, where the main objective of this incursion into Ukrainian territory by the Russians is not to launch a massive offensive to capture Kharkiv. It is instead to relocate and send Ukrainian troops to this section of the front line, widening the front and hitting the Ukrainian equipment while they are on the move. Ukrainian air defense, multi-launch rocket system, artillery, and other units of equipment have been hit while on the move. And once they're deployed, they are in a position where the Russians have a significant air force advantage. They have air superiority in this section of the front line, and they have a lot of missile rocket forces. They have Lancet drones that fly regularly across the front, and they're heavily destroying Ukrainian equipment moving to the northern section. Spreading out the Ukrainian forces and having them take a lot of casualties in this movement before finally reaching the front, where they're being heavily bombarded in the frontline towns, because right next to it is Russian territory. That means they have great logistics in the area, while the Ukrainians are limited in striking within Russian territory with Western weapons. This gives the Russians a significant advantage in this section of the front line, and the new meat grinder for the Ukrainians has begun. And this is while the Ukrainians are already in critical need of additional manpower, and at the same time, Ukrainian soldiers near the front are complaining that they are not even seeing any of this additional equipment and artillery shells that they have been promised. So the Ukrainian situation really is near a breaking point. This is said by Ukrainian soldiers. At the same time, the Russian soldiers are expecting that as the situation develops, as they continue to launch new operations, the Ukrainians will be more and more hard-stilled. If the Russians captured 250 square kilometers within a week in the Kharkiv offensive, they'll capture 500 or 1,000 square kilometers in the Sumy direction, and then they'll capture 10,000 square kilometers in the Chernihiv direction. That is the current objective of the Russians, spreading out the Ukrainians, hitting them on the move, and expanding their control in the vast areas of the Ukrainian country. And that is it for the analysis. Moving back to the frontline updates, we see here in the direction northwest of Ocheretine towards Novoalexandrivka, the Russians have slightly expanded their positions in the northern direction. This is to hit the Ukrainian flank by attacking north of Novoalexandrivka. Combined with the recent advances here to the south, the Russians are hitting the flanks of the town as they push westwards of Ocheretine. This is to develop the offensive operations in the direction of the highway between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk. To the south, Russians have started an attack in the form of an assault towards Yasnobrodivka, capturing the entirety of the road between Umanske and Netailove. The Russians are now starting the offensive operations to attack the village of Yasnobrodivka and gain control over the wedge here to the south of Umanske and north of Netailove. Further south, we see here in the direction of Mervopil, the Russians have captured the rest of the Dasha area and are now extremely close to the town of Ulyaipole, which is a logistical hub in the southern front. Finally, there is a bunch of geolocated footage of all of the recent Russian advances. There's this one of Medvopil, where the Russians captured the rest of the Dacha area. There's this one by Yasnobrodivka, south of Umansk and north of Netailove, of the recent Russian push. There is this one in the direction of Robotyne, of the Russians reaching the eastern and northern parts of the village. There is this one in the direction of Netailove, where the Russians reached the western outskirts of the town. And there's this one in the direction of Berestove, where the Russians launched their assaults before storming the village itself. An assault operation is the Russians launching an attack, or the Ukrainians launching an attack, either side launching an attack towards a village. Once they reach the outskirts of it and start attacking it, it turns from an assault operation to a storming operation. That is the difference between the two. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.